everyone, Sarah with the Hobby Lobby Creative Studio here. We are talking ruffles, ruffles, and more ruffles today. They look really complicated to make, but actually they're a cinch, so I'll show you how right after this. Well, what better way to add some personality to something than to add a ruffle to it? Even if you have the bare minimum of sewing skills, you can make a ruffle. So I'm going to break down all the steps for you and show you two really simple ways of making ruffles. So the item I'm going to be working with today is this really cute little baby onesie. And you can actually pick this same one up in the same color, or you can find different colors of this same onesie and in different sizes at your local Hobby Lobby or on the website. So the first thing you want to do whenever you've determined what fabric you want to use to make your ruffles is to determine where you need to put your first ruffle on your onesie. So a good trick for that is to lay your onesie out flat, just like this, with the front side facing up. Go ahead and make sure it's buttoned and everything. And what you're going to do is just kind of crease this little bottom fold right here with your iron to kind of make a reference for you. And this should be about 3 inches for this particular size of onesie, which is a 6 to 12 month onesie. So it might be a little bit different depending on what size onesie you're working with, but essentially it'll be around 3 inches from this fold to the snaps. And then after you give it a really light little press just to make a crease for a reference, I've just stuck a couple of straight pins in here too in case my crease starts to come out or anything. That way I can still have a reference. So this serves as our reference point for this first ruffle right here on our onesie. So the bottom of this ruffle right here will go right along, if I can kind of line it up. So it'll be right along that bottom edge where we put that crease. So now we need to determine the width that our ruffle needs to be before we can cut it out of our fabric, of course. So for this spot, I believe the width of our ruffle is about 7 inches across, which that looks about right. So we're just going to do it from this hemmed edge to this hemmed edge over here. So about right there. So we're actually going to double that number to account for the gathers that we need to make in the ruffle. So we're going to cut out 14 inches of fabric, and then for the height, what you want to do is just determine how high you want your ruffle to be. So on these particular ruffles, we wanted our finished ruffle to be 2 inches high. So we cut out 3 inches so that we could have a 1/2 inch hem on both the top and the bottom. So our final piece that we need to cut out is 3 inches by 14 inches for this particular onesie. So here's my piece right here that I already have cut out to 3 inches by 14 inches. And the next step we want to do is to actually put a zigzag stitch on one of the longer edges, just like this. And we're doing that because this fabric frays very easily, so we want it to stay intact whenever it's laundered, and doing the zigzag stitch will help to finish that edge and keep it from coming unraveled in the wash. So if you need a little bit more explanation about how to finish an edge with a zigzag stitch, check out our Sewing Basics video, and we go into that stitch more in depth as well as some other options for finishing your edges. So after you've done this, what you want to do is now work on your side and your bottom edges. So here's one that we already have pre-pressed, and let's turn it so that here's our zigzagged edge. So this is the top edge of our ruffle, and then what we want to do next is press our side edges in first, and what we're doing here is called a narrow hem. So what we're going to do first is press in 1/2 inch, and then we're going to fold that raw edge in to the crease so that you end up with a 1/4 inch hem right here. And do this on both sides to the sides first, and then you're going to do that same narrow hem along the bottom. So you're going to press it up 1/2 inch first, fold the raw edge into the crease so that you end up with no raw edges and that your final size is a 1/4 inch hem all the way around. So we think it looks a little bit nicer if you do your sides first and then you do along your bottom edge next. Now with your top edge, you're just going to fold that down and press 1/2 inch for now. We're not going to be doing any sewing, and you're not going to do a narrow hem on this part because we don't want to add that extra bulk there, since that's where we're going to be doing our gathering a little bit later. So that will kind of inhibit us if we put that extra bulk right there. So after you've done that, go ahead and stitch your side edges first and then do your bottom edge. So here's what you'll end up with whenever you're finished. So we still have our top edge only pressed to 1/2 inch, but now we have our side edges and our bottom edge sewn, and that's looking really nice. And now we're ready to add our basting stitches. And a basting stitch is the longest stitch that's available on your machine, and it's what we're going to use to make the gathers of our ruffle. So everyone's machine is a little bit different, of course, so just make sure that on your machine you have it set to the longest stitch available. So we're going to be making our first basting stitch along the very top of our fold here, just kind of as close to the edge as we can get it. So I'm going to go ahead and put my needle down into my fabric just so I can have a good reference point for starting. Remember also not to do any back stitching with a basting stitch because that will secure your thread too much and then you won't be able to tug on it to make your gathers. So once you have your foot down, just sew a basting stitch all the way down the top fold of your strip of fabric. Just go right off the fabric without back stitching. Okay, so when you're done, make sure that you cut your threads off to where you have enough to grab onto with your hand later whenever you need to pull on your threads to make your gathers. So I'm going to cut off about that much. Okay, now we're going to make a second basting stitch about 1/4 inch down from our first basting stitch. And the reason why we're adding 2 basting stitches is because we'll have a backup in case we're tugging on our stitches to make our gather. If one breaks, then we'll have a backup and we don't lose our ruffle. And it's also just easier in general to tug on a couple more threads to make your gathers. And then your ruffle, more importantly, will just lay better with 2 basting stitches and a top stitch in between those 2. And it'll just look a lot nicer that way. So we're going to sew our second basting stitch now. Just another reminder not to backstitch. All right. So again, on this side, cut your threads long enough to where you can grab onto them. So now we just want to tug on the bobbin or bottom threads. So our threads from this bottom side. And these are what we're going to tug on to make our gathers. So you just have to be a little bit patient with this part, working from both sides of your ruffle. And just keep sliding this down and tugging on your bottom threads until you get to the width that you need for where you're going to be adding this ruffle to on your onesie. So now I want to show you another really interesting way to make a ruffle using embroidery thread. Embroidery thread is great because it's really thick and it's great for working with thicker fabrics because when you're tugging on it, when using it as a basting stitch, it won't break near as easily as thread might. So I'm going to show you a really quick, easy way to make a ruffle using this thread. So what I've done is for whatever strip of fabric that you're working with to make your ruffle, just cut your embroidery thread a little bit longer than that strip. So I've already lined mine up. I'm going to be working on the same fold as I just added my other basting stitches to. And with my thread, I've lined it up right in the middle of that fold. Now on your sewing machine, you want your settings to be on a zigzag stitch, on a fairly wide zigzag stitch. Now for this size of fold, the widest zigzag setting is actually too big for this particular fold of this fabric. So just make sure that it's wide enough to go on either side of your embroidery thread without touching it. What you're doing is encasing that embroidery thread in that zigzag stitch, and then you're going to pull on that thread later to make your gather. So what you want to do, you don't have to worry about back stitching or anything on this one as well, and I've already got it a little bit started. So just continue to sew down the entire edge, just so that your zigzag is hitting on either side of your embroidery thread without touching it. If you happen to catch the embroidery thread, that's going to defeat the purpose. You won't be able to tug on it at the end to make your gather. So just make sure that you have your zigzag wide enough not to touch your thread. Okay, so when you get to the end, put your that up. So here's what it should look like. So you see those little zigzags all the way around your embroidery thread. And now you can simply pull on that embroidery thread, and look how easy that makes a ruffle. And it's super quick and very simple to do. So look how fast we made a ruffle using that method. So that's a great alternative method, is using embroidery thread. So after you have your ruffle all gathered and you're ready to put it onto your onesie, what we're going to do is slip a small mat, or even if you have a piece of cardboard sitting around, into the inside of our onesie, just like this. And what that's going to do is it's going to separate the back layer from the front layer, so that whenever we're pinning our ruffle on, our pins don't go through to the front side of our onesie, and it just stays on this back layer here that we're working on. So that's a handy little trick for you to try whenever it's time to pin these ruffles on. Okay, so with our ruffle, what we can do is just use our basting stitches to keep tugging and to line up the width that we need for this particular spot that we're adding our ruffle to. So now when we start pinning this on, you can pin either side first, or you can start at one end and work your way over, whichever way works for you. So when you put your pins in, make sure that you put them in perpendicular to your basting stitches and not parallel alongside them, because that will keep your ruffle from shifting around and moving. This will just keep your ruffle more secure in general if you put your pins up and down like this. And you'll use quite a few pins on this part, so don't be afraid to put some really close together all the way across, because what we're doing is just making sure that we are putting this ruffle on nice and straight across our entire line, and that we don't have any little waves from the gathering. We just want to make as straight of a line as we can in this part. So just keep putting pins at really close intervals like this all the way across your onesie. Okay, and whenever you're finished pinning, you'll have one that looks just like this. So see, we have quite a few pins on here, and they're doing their job. We have a nice flat line, and now we're ready to add our top stitch right in between these two basting stitches. So when you're ready to sew your ruffle onto your onesie, what we need to do is to make sure the free arm of our sewing machine is accessible. So what that means on this particular machine is that I need to take this piece off, just slide it out, maybe a little bit different on yours. And now I have this arm that's left. And what that allows me to do is to slip this onesie onto it. And that puts the machine in between the back layer and the front layer of my onesie, so that when I do my stitches, I'm only stitching onto the back layer. So now what we're going to do is put our top stitch just right smack dab down the middle of our two basting stitches. And on this part, since we have a lot of pins securing our ruffle into place, just make sure that you remove your pin before your needle goes over it. Otherwise, you'll hurt your sewing machine. So just make sure to keep an eye on your needles as you're stitching down your ruffle. And on this one too, don't forget your back stitches, since we are securing the ruffle to our onesie. The last thing left to do is to simply remove your basting stitches. Sometimes you can do this by hand, but since this ruffle is so small and gathered, you'll probably have to utilize a seam ripper to help you out a little bit. So what I would do is, just starting at one end, just rip out a couple of stitches every inch or so, and then just continue to pull out those basting stitches until they're completely removed. Now, if you had used the embroidery thread method to make your ruffle that looks like this, after you stitch this onto your garment or whatever you're adding this ruffle to, you could either leave your zigzag stitches in, or you might take them out if they're going to show. But beyond that, all you have to do is simply pull this embroidery thread out, just like that. And of course, this will stay gathered because you've already sewn it onto your garment. Now, from this point on, you're totally done with this ruffle. This ruffle is good to go. So now what you want to do is measure the width of your next spot where you're going to put the next ruffle on. So in this case, what we would do is just determine where we want our next ruffle to be and how much we want them to overlap. Now, we've just overlapped the ruffles on this particular onesie to where we have about 1/4 of an inch of the ruffle underneath showing. Now, we've done that because this is eventually going to be on a rounded surface. So we wanted to compensate and cover the ruffles and overlap them a little bit more because they're actually going to separate a little bit more once they're on that rounded surface as opposed to them being on a flat surface. So you can just kind of play around with overlapping and determine how much you want to overlap your ruffles. But for us, we've left about 1/4 of an inch, like I said, showing of the ruffle underneath. So you would just obviously stack the next ruffle on, stitch it on before moving on to your next ruffle, and just keep stacking and going up your onesie just like this. So look at how adorable our little onesie turned out, all just from adding some really simple ruffles. Now the last little bit of flair that we want to give our onesie is this little group of fabric rosettes that we've made, and we sew them onto a separate backer. That way you could add this onto wherever you'd like on your own onesie. So once you know the basics of how to make a ruffle, the possibilities are really endless when it comes to things you could add ruffles to. For example, here we have so many cute items made with ruffles. We have jeans and this adorable ruffled dress. You could even add ruffles to some leggings. We have a super cute little diaper cover, some leg warmers, even a bib. You could just make so much cute stuff. So I really hope you enjoyed this fun ruffle tutorial today. Thanks for stopping by, everybody, and we'll see you next time.